where we had left off, Warren had already called Miss Christine, and then they somehow ended up at Jax's grandparents' house. That's where they all stayed that weekend, and so that's why Nolan's keys were over there. They had to have been at the grandparents' house, who mysteriously never showed up during any of these confrontations.
Either her service was bad because she was on the back side of the aisle, on the south side, or my service was bad, and it was just hard to get through. If you're motivated enough to do it, yeah. Like, I made a phone call to my mom, and I had to call her like 8 times before she picked up because...
Warren Hudson says the cell service on Horn Island was bad. That's why, according to him, getting through to his mother was difficult. Fair enough. Except Warren also says something else. He says he called her 8 times before she finally answered. And then he says, if you're motivated enough to do it, yeah. So which story are we supposed to believe? Was the service really so bad that getting through was difficult? Or was Warren motivated enough to keep calling until she finally picked up? Because those two explanations don't exactly sit comfortably next to each other. And that isn't even the biggest problem, because once you put those calls beside Nolan Wells' phone movements, the Coast Guard timeline, the boat footage, and the photographs from that day, the story starts developing some very serious cracks. Big ones. And tonight, we're going straight into those cracks. Because Nolan Wells was 18 years old. He went out on the water on the 4th of July, and he never came home. The basic story sounds simple. A boat experienced problems. Nolan was supposedly left behind. His friends came back. The Coast Guard was contacted. His family started looking for him. That's the story we've been given. But when you start putting the statements next to the timestamps, the phone data, the boats, and the photographs, things stop looking simple very quickly. And that's why we're here, because we're not just listening to what people say. We're comparing what they say to what the evidence appears to show. We're going to look at Nolan's phone. We're going to look at the Coast Guard timeline. We're going to look at the boat that appears to have been connected to another vessel. We're going to look at photographs that the TikTok investigator believes may have been altered. And we're going to look at a woman in a red-striped swimsuit who keeps appearing around these boats. But before we get there, there's something else we need to talk about. Where Nolan disappeared. Because this didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened in Mississippi. And if we're going to talk honestly about the disappearance of a young black man in Mississippi, we can't pretend the state's racial history doesn't exist. Mississippi has one of the darkest racial histories in America. We're talking about slavery, segregation, Jim Crow, racial terror, and decades of violence against black Americans. Mississippi didn't formally ratify the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery until 1995, more than a century after it became part of the Constitution. The ratification wasn't formally recognized until 2013 because of a clerical issue. And between 1882 and 1968, Mississippi recorded more documented lynchings than any other state. That's history. But history becomes relevant when we're asking whether institutions have treated black families fairly and whether every unanswered question in a case has received the attention it deserves. Because when a young black teenager disappears under circumstances that remain disputed, the question isn't only, what happened to him? It's also, did everyone do everything they could to find out? Were every witness questioned? Was every boat accounted for? Was every timeline checked? Were the inconsistencies followed? And did Nolan's family receive the urgency, transparency, and answers they had every right to expect? Because institutions don't get to demand blind trust. They have to earn it. And that's particularly important when the public story starts colliding with the evidence. Nolan was 18. He was black. He went out on a boat with people he knew, and he never came home. So when the timeline contains unanswered questions, those questions deserve to be examined. That's not me saying every white person involved is guilty. That's not me saying every law enforcement officer involved acted improperly. It's asking whether the investigation was as thorough as it needed to be. And right now, there are questions. A lot of them. And some of the most interesting questions are coming from an independent TikTok investigator who started pulling apart the photographs, the boat movements, the phone data, and the timeline. No badge, no subpoena power. No investigative department behind her. Just publicly available material and one simple instinct. Wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. And that's exactly what you're about to watch. I'm going to play the footage. All of it. 13 minutes. No interruptions. No talking over it. No telling you what to think while you're watching. Just the interviews and the digital evidence. So pay attention. Listen to the wording. Watch the timestamps. Watch the boats. Watch the phone. And pay attention to what is said and what isn't. Because when those 13 minutes are over, I'm coming back to put all of it together. And if you're new here, this is Cold Case Watch Central. We follow cold cases, reconstruct timelines, examine the evidence, and go back to the details that can get overlooked when everyone else has moved on. So subscribe to Cold Case Watch Central and turn on notifications, because this investigation isn't ending with this video. But for the next 13 minutes, don't take my word for anything. Watch the footage. Listen carefully. Make your own observations. And then come back with me. Because after it ends, we're going through it piece by piece. Let's get into it.
Oh, these little liars. I told y'all that Jax was the ringleader. I told y'all. He sat in this interview and he was telling stories about shit that he wasn't even there to witness. So let's break down some of the stuff that I heard in this interview. Let's start with Warren's first phone call, because y'all will remember that Warren said that he was over at Ava's house for that 4th of July party when they all started realizing that Nolan was missing, and he called Miss Christine at 11 o'clock.
One of the first things I told Miss Christine Wells in the first phone call that ever occurred with anything to do with Nolan Wells being gone, because I was the first person to call Miss Christine about anything. First phone call, anything to do with Nolan Wells, was me making a phone call to Christine Wells. And one of the first things I said to her, with multiple witnesses here, pull up the phone call if you want. She said, oh, well, Nolan's location is with y'all at, where the house we were at. And I was like, well, no, he left his phone with us. I told her this.
And yesterday, the same time that this interview came out, Christine Wells said this.
360 says that he's on land, and he was like, well, no, I mean, when we have his phone.
So both versions of the story say that Warren didn't tell her about the phone until after she confronted him with the 360. Now, Warren tells Miss Christine that he knows somebody in the Coast Guard and that he's going to call them, which is very fucking different than calling the Coast Guard, which absolutely explains why the Coast Guard came out and said at first that they had not received a call from the kids that night. The Coast Guard's initial statement said they weren't informed until 12:30. Then the Coast Guard later changed their story and said, oh wait, actually we did. And it seems to me that that first call was most likely an off-the-record to a friend kind of deal, which means these people freaked out and didn't call the Coast Guard until after all these people showed up at Jax's house. Which would explain why in the course of this interview it went from Warren called the Coast Guard to we did. Now, when the subject turns to how the family got the phone back from these boys, you'll notice that there was a couple slip-ups.
Warren, you weren't at the house, and so you weren't there when they came to get the phone and all that. So
now remember, Warren just said that he wasn't at the house when the phone was got. And then Morgan talks about getting a phone call from one of the people in Christine Wells' group.
And how did they get the phone back?
So I got a call from a kid we went to high school with. He called me just asking me questions. He saw people posting on Snapchat, like the picture that was circulating.
Except this picture wasn't posted until July 5th. So how could this picture have been circulating on Snapchat that night? But let's continue.
And he called and he was asking questions. He was like, where's Nolan? When's the last time y'all seen him? And then he was like, so where are y'all at? And I told him, I said, we're at Jax's house. And then Warren got on the phone, and I don't know.
So they come to my house, right? And they kind of
Hold on, before we get there. Was it confrontational, or was it just just trying to find? It was confrontational already.
Wouldn't y'all agree?
Yeah.
He was 110%.
He was very
confrontational.
And when did Was this on the night of the 4th or the next
this
day?
was the night when this was before they came and got the phone.
So this is the night of the 4th, yes.
You guys are missing a part of the story. How did you get from Ava's house to Jax's house? Because Miss Christine is watching you guys on the Life 360. So suddenly she's seeing the phone leave one location and go to another. Of course I would be upset. And now all of a sudden Warren is there when the phone stuff starts happening? He's listening to the phone call? Now I need y'all to remember that Warren also said that the phone was in his truck on the first conversation, as we have from this report. Meaning if we were to believe Warren that he was not there when everybody showed up looking for the phone at some time in between 11 and 1 a.m., so then that would mean after they heard this angry phone call, Warren gets the phone out of his vehicle and puts it in Jack's house and then leaves.
There's probably like 10, 15 people in my house I don't even know. And they're all up in our faces, going crazy, asking where Nolan is, and we don't know. And finally they get into Wyatt's face, and they're like, where's your boat? Where's the boat at?
Demanding his address.
Demanding his address and stuff like that. And he finally ends up giving it to them. We give them the phone. They have the phone at this point. Then they get the address to his house. Then they go to his house. And they're searching all over his boat, what I heard and stuff like that. Well, anyways, I don't really know much about that. But they come back to my house at around 1 o'clock in the morning.
We called law enforcement. I was with Wyatt at the time after we left Jax's house that night. I was with Wyatt, and one person we were with saw that their location was headed towards Wyatt's house. And so Wyatt got on the phone with 911 and was like, hey, these people are on the way to my house or already at my house. My mom and my dad are there alone, and they know nothing about this. But Wyatt's mom actually, when they were looking at the boat, they were actually walking from the boat, and she came out and started talking to them.
Okay, so let me get this straight. Wyatt, Morgan, and Jax were all together. Warren was gone for some reason at this point. 10 to 15 people just barge into your house. Don't know why your grandparents weren't around. That might explain some things, huh? Guess y'all had the house all to your fucking self that weekend. But then they ask Wyatt for his address so that they can go look at the boat. Wyatt gives them the address. They start heading over there. Wyatt and Morgan get into a car and leave Jax's house. Somebody else that you were with that we aren't hearing about is tracking someone else's phone. I don't know if it was somebody who was with the group that they had access to, or if they were tracking Nolan's phone and they saw it was heading to Wyatt's house. And even though Wyatt gave them the address, and instead of calling his parents, he calls 911 and tells them, my parents don't know anything about that's going on. Can you send police over there? Now, mind you, it was about half an hour after being on the phone with Warren that Christine was able to actually call and report him missing. But she was having to go back and forth and go down to all these different agencies because nobody would fucking help her. And frankly, I want to know why all of this confrontation was left out of the fucking report. Like, if this family had to be removed from 2 different properties by the police, why is there no record of that? And in fact, it wasn't until after these confrontations that MDMR and Ocean Springs Police apparently had their little conversations about who was going to be taking over the case. Because remember, the Jackson County Sheriff Lieutenant told them that deputies had spoken with several friends that had traveled to the island on the vessel with Nolan, and that when they were left, he was in the company of an unknown female. So now, even though Warren had supposedly called the Coast Guard, all these family members are telling the police that the kid is missing. These are the people that last saw them. They're all like, we last saw him on the island. Still, the deputies said that they did not have reason to believe that there was any water-related exigencies or emergencies. Don't worry, y'all. I've got a lot fucking more to say about this stuff, so come back for part 2. I'm going to be immediately recording it because Warren fucked up pretty badly in this interview, and I'll show you why. Where we had left off, Warren had already called Miss Christine, and then they somehow ended up at Jax's grandparents' house. That's where they all stayed that weekend, and so that's why Nolan's keys were over there. They had to have been at the grandparents' house, who mysteriously never showed up during any of these confrontations. Somehow the phone had gone from the party that they were all at to Jax's place, and then Warren left after a phone call to Morgan. According to them, 10 to 15 people showed up and just walked into Jax's house and demanded the phone. Wyatt gave the address in which the boat was at. They all start migrating over there. Then Morgan and Wyatt and another friend are tracking their 360s and seeing that they're going over to Wyatt's house. Then they call 911 to tell them that the police are on the way to his house. Then they're searching the boat, and then they come back to Jax's house around 1 o'clock in the morning, according to him. Mind you, that's when they explain to the police about their friend being missing. And so then the report says at 1:38 in the morning, the Jackson County Sheriff's Office say that they spoke to several of the friends that were on the vessel with Nolan, saying that he was in the company of an unknown female. But Morgan, Jax, and Warren all claimed that they did not travel to the island on the same boat as Nolan. So who did they talk to? Because it sounds to me like they had told the police that they were on the same boat as him. Keeping in mind that this is what Warren told Miss Christine.
Named Katie. And so then it turned into, Katie is also missing. No one can find her. And the explanation of no one knows this Katie, like we've never met her.
And Tristan said this.
I was talking on my other buddy's phone, talking to Warren. He was dialing Coast Guard because he hung up the phone and was like, hey, this is them, but, and hung up the phone. And that was the last time I talked to him.
Mind you, Tristan is friends with Katie. They are mutuals. I have confirmed this. So now that we've got that timeline fucking straight, let's back up to something that Warren said during this interview.
If you're motivated enough to do it, yeah. Like, I made a phone call to my mom, and I had to call her like 8 times before she picked up because either her service was bad, she was on the back side of the aisle on the south side, or my service was bad, and it was just hard to get through.
Do y'all see that? Let me play it again slower for you.
Either her service was bad, she was on the back side of the aisle on the south side, or my service was bad, and it was just hard to get through.
Oh no. Not only did Warren confirm that his mom was on the south side of the island, but Warren himself said that if you're motivated enough, you can call somebody. I tried calling my mom 8 times. Yet this is what he said last time.
A little off the island. You have cell coverage. And even on the island, like I called my mom when we were on the island, it was fine.
So which is it? Did you call your mom with ease, or did you try to call her 8 times because you were motivated to get in touch with her? But Warren wasn't the only one to slip up, because listen.
And he's on the phone with Cito, and he's trying to get them on the phone. And as he stated in the moment, he's like, Cito's just asking all these dumb questions. I can't figure out what's going on. And so finally he hangs up, and after the trim to the motor started to work again. So they manually trim it down by the buttons on the motor, trimmed it down, and some electronics started to come back on, and they got the boat to crank over, and they're like, all right, untie us.
So first off, Jax just proved that the boys put the phone on mute during the call with Cito, because I've listened to the entire 8-minute call, and at no point does they ever say anything about them asking all these stupid questions. Then he said after they hung up on the Cito, that's when it started working again, and they said, okay, untie us, implying that it had been tied up to the other boat the entire time. But we see in this video that they are hauling the line back in right here as he's on the phone. See, you can see right here where the line is being pulled in from across the way where the boat is stationed. Meaning he had already hung up with Cito at that point, and he had to have been on the phone with someone else. And what we see here is, once again, we have an interview where they go into so much detail about stuff that doesn't fucking matter.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and first off explain a boat.
We fucking get how a bilge pump works. We get it by now. Stop fucking talking about the bilge pump. What we actually want to hear about is the multiple stops that were made before ending up back at the grandparents' house before they even took the boat to the boat dock. We want you guys to explain how the Cito was canceled by the grandfather on the captain's private line before you guys had even hung up with Cito. That's why nobody believes a fucking word that you are saying. Because I showed y'all yesterday how AI had clearly doctored these photos. If you missed it, look, silver pole. Look, no silver pole. It's actually white. And if you look at this picture in the grandparents' driveway of the Triton, you will see that the little handrails are not leaning over. You will see that the rails are going straight up and down and not leaning, which is why I also suspect that the identity of whoever this is was intentionally covered up. Because first off, who wears this weird swimsuit thing? This is somebody who, if they were with them, would have stood out in a crowd. But this woman who's in a red striped swimsuit with a white baseball cap shows up in a lot of different pictures, just oh so obscured. Here she is again, handing out beers on Bart's boat. So I personally suspect that whoever that was in fact on the Triton, and they used AI to change her clothing and to obscure her identity. Because I think this was either Warren's mother or Wyatt's stepmother, which would explain the older female voice people have said they've heard on the Ceto. Because otherwise, why would he need to call his mother 8 times? Unless, according to his own words,
If you're motivated enough to do it, yeah.
because remember, there is a 4th boat out there. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Holy fuck, I just accidentally stumbled onto something that literally is concrete proof. Oh my god, next video coming. Oh my god!
All right. Now you've seen it. 13 minutes. And now we can actually talk about what we just watched. Because I'm not interested in screaming at you for 13 minutes and then pretending that every strange detail automatically proves a crime. That's not investigation. That's entertainment. What matters is whether the statements, the timestamps, the phone data, the boats, and the photographs can all exist together without contradicting one another. And that's where this gets interesting. Let's start with Warren. Warren repeatedly establishes himself as the first person who contacted Christine Wells about Nolan. He doesn't just mention it once. He emphasizes it. He wants that point on the record. He was first. Okay, let's give him that. Let's assume Warren really was the first person to call Christine. Now ask, what exactly did he tell her? According to Warren, he told Christine that Nolan's phone was with them. That's important, because Christine was trying to figure out where her son was, and apparently the phone was already in the possession of the group. But then we have the Life 360 information. According to the reconstruction presented by the TikTok investigator, Nolan's phone was showing up on land, not where you'd expect Nolan himself to be. And then the phone moves. That's where the question changes. We're no longer simply asking, where was Nolan? We're asking, who had Nolan's phone? And those are 2 completely different questions. A phone doesn't have to be with its owner. Somebody can pick it up, carry it, put it in a vehicle, move it from one location to another. So if Nolan is missing and his phone is moving, whoever controlled that phone becomes extremely important to the timeline. Now here's where Warren's story gets interesting. He says he told Christine the phone was with them. But according to the material we've just watched, the precise location wasn't immediately volunteered. Christine had to push for more information. And that's significant. Because if you're trying to help a mother find her missing 18-year-old son, saying, "We have his phone," isn't nearly as useful as saying, "We have his phone, and here's exactly where it is." That's the information that helps someone find a missing person. So why wasn't the location immediately clear? That's a question. Then we get to the Coast Guard. And this is where the timeline gets seriously uncomfortable. The material shows an initial statement that no call had been received. Then a later statement indicating a call around 12:30 a.m. If both statements are accurately represented, something changed. And I'm not going to immediately tell you. That means somebody lied. That's too easy. The first question should be, what changed? Was there an earlier call? Was it made to someone personally known to Warren? Was that separate from the official Coast Guard communication? Was the 12:30 call the first formal distress call? Those questions can be answered. There are call records. There are logs. There are timestamps. That's why this matters. Because between the earlier timeline and the 12:30 a.m. call is a significant window of time. And according to the reconstruction we've just watched, during that window, the phone was moving. The boats were moving. People were making calls. And eventually, law enforcement became involved. That gap deserves scrutiny. Now let's talk about Jack's description of the CTO call. Jack describes an emergency situation. The boat is supposedly in trouble. The operator is asking questions. And Jack says they were frustrated by those questions and eventually hung up. But according to the investigator's analysis of the audio, the call itself sounds calm and procedural. So now we have another discrepancy. Either Jack's memory of the call is inaccurate, or he's describing a different call. And if he's describing a different call, how many calls were there? That's the question, because one call versus multiple calls can completely change the reconstruction of the night. Then comes the tow line. This is where the footage becomes especially interesting. The investigator points to a frame showing the line being hauled while the call is still taking place. If that interpretation is correct, the Triton was physically connected to another vessel while the Coast Guard communication was happening. And that matters, because now the question becomes, who was on the other boat? Why were they connected? How long had they been connected? Could that vessel have helped? Could the people aboard it have witnessed what happened to Nolan? And why wasn't the presence of that vessel clearly part of the account? Those are legitimate investigative questions. Now, the footage alone doesn't prove what happened. But it absolutely gives us something to investigate. Because if there was another vessel, that vessel should be identifiable. Registration, owner, passengers, route, everything. Then we come back to Nolan's phone. According to the reconstruction, the phone moves from Ava's house to Jackson's grandparents' house, toward Wyatt's dock, and eventually back toward Jackson's house. Again, who moved it? Because Warren says he wasn't there when the phone was retrieved. If that's accurate, somebody else had control of it. And that person matters. Then people connected to Christine begin tracking the phone. They start showing up at Jackson's house. And suddenly we're no longer dealing with a simple missing person situation. We're dealing with confrontation. People want the phone. People want answers. And then Wyatt calls 911. But listen to the reason presented for that call. It's not simply, my friend is missing. The concern is that people are coming toward the house and his parents are there. That's an important distinction. Because at that moment, two different groups appear to have two different priorities. Nolan's family is trying to find Nolan. The people at the house are concerned about the people coming to the property. And then deputies arrive. They search. They speak with people. And eventually they leave. But another question remains. According to the material presented here, law enforcement was told that Nolan was with an unknown woman on the island. So, who supplied that information? That's something investigators should be able to establish. Because somebody gave that account. Who? That's not something I want to guess about. That's something I want documented. Now we get to the fourth boat. And this is where I want to slow down. Because the fourth boat theory is potentially significant, but it needs to be established with actual records. Not TikTok. Not speculation. Not somebody saying, I think I saw another boat. Records. Boat registration. Hull identification number. Ownership. Photographs. GPS data. If there were 4 boats, identify all 4. If there were 3, then explain why the evidence appears to suggest another vessel. That's how you solve it. Then we have the 8 calls. 8 calls to Warren's mother. Now maybe those calls were completely innocent. Maybe Warren was frightened. Maybe he was desperately trying to reach her. Maybe the cell service really was terrible. All of those explanations are possible. But then ask, why 8 calls? What was happening during those calls? What was being discussed? When exactly did they occur? Were they before the distress call? During it? After it? Because a call log can answer questions that memory can't. And then we reach the photographs. This is where the investigator's theory becomes particularly interesting. She points to apparent differences in the boat between photographs. The handrails, the poles, the positioning, other visual details. Now, are those definitely edits? That still needs to be established. Perspective can change. Lighting can change. Compression can change. Different cameras can produce different-looking images. But if an image was actually altered, then the next question is obvious. Why? Why alter a photograph of a boat? What was the purpose? What was someone trying to change? And that's where the woman in the red-striped swimsuit comes in. The investigator believes the same woman appears in multiple photographs and around multiple boats. Her face isn't clearly visible. She's partially obscured. Her identity isn't immediately obvious. And that gives us one very simple question. Who is she? Not, she must be guilty. Not, she definitely knows what happened. Just, who is she? Identify her. Find out where she was. Find out which boat she was on. Find out who she was with. That's how you test the theory. The investigator has suggested that this woman could be Warren's mother or Wyatt's stepmother. Again, that's a theory. It is not established simply because somebody believes the photographs look similar. But if that identity can be confirmed, it could answer several other questions. Where was she? Was she on the island? Was she on another boat? Was she near the Triton? Did she hear the distress call? Did she know Nolan? Was she interviewed? Those are the questions that matter. And if she was on another vessel, then we're right back at the fourth boat. That's why these separate pieces keep converging on the same problem. The phone, the calls, the Coast Guard, the boats, the photographs, the woman, the timeline. They all lead back to one fundamental question. Who was where and when? Because that is what needs to be established. And right now, according to the material we've reviewed, there are too many unanswered questions surrounding that timeline. So let's put them on the table. 1. Why does Warren describe the cell service as a problem, while also describing 8 attempts to reach his mother? 2. What exactly happened with the Coast Guard calls, and why does the reported timeline change? 3. Who physically possessed Nolan's phone while it was moving between locations? 4. Why does the footage appear to show another vessel connected to the Triton during the distress communication? 5. Who was the woman in the red-striped swimsuit? 6. Were any of the photographs actually altered? And if so, by whom? And why? 7. Was there a fourth boat? And who was on it? Those aren't conclusions. They're questions. And that's an important distinction. Because I don't want this case solved by internet speculation. I don't want Nolan's family getting another theory. I want evidence. I want the phone records. I want the boat records. I want the call logs. I want the photographs properly examined. I want every vessel accounted for. And I want every person who was on that water accounted for. Because Nolan was 18 years old. His family wasn't looking for a mystery. They were looking for their son. And if the first hours of this case contain unanswered questions, those questions don't become less important because time has passed. They become more important. And the fourth boat, that's the one I'm watching closely. Because if it existed, we need to know. Who owned it? Who was on it? Where did it go? And what did those people see? I'm going to keep digging into the vessel records, the timeline, the photographs, and the people connected to these boats. But I'm not going to put a name on something until I can verify it. Because there's a difference between a bombshell and a rumor. And if we're going to investigate this case, we're going to do it properly. But make no mistake, the questions aren't going away. The 8 calls are still there. The phone movements are still there. The Coast Guard timeline is still there. The boat footage is still there. The photographs are still there. And somewhere inside that timeline is the answer to one very important question. Who was on the fourth boat? That's where we're going next. Key final CTA. K. And if you want to follow this investigation as we continue pulling apart that timeline, subscribe to Cold Case Watch Central and turn on notifications. And I want to hear from you. What stood out to you the most? Was it the 8 calls? The phone movements? The Coast Guard timeline? The second vessel? The photographs? Or that possible fourth boat? Drop your thoughts in the comments, but keep it factual. If you're making a claim, tell us what evidence you're basing it on. Because here at Cold Case Watch Central, we're not interested in chasing rumors. We're interested in following the evidence. And if you know something legitimate about the Nolan Wells case, especially information that could help identify the fourth vessel or establish who was actually on the water that night, send it in. We're going to keep pulling at this thread. We're going to keep checking the timeline. And we're going to keep asking the questions that haven't been answered. Because eventually, the timeline has to make sense. And if it doesn't, somebody needs to explain why. We'll keep watching.